Welcome to English Never Give Up podcast.
Picture this. Someone spends 6 months listening to English news radio every single day, writing down words they do not understand, rewinding the same clips over and over, and at the end of those 6 months, they still cannot follow a basic conversation at a coffee shop. Sound familiar? Today, we are breaking down easy English listening for A1 and A2 learners, specifically what those levels actually mean, why listening at the right level is the single most important thing a new learner can do, and how to build a listening habit that actually moves the needle. By the end of this episode, you will know exactly how to use graded listening content to go from confused to confident. And I have got someone here who has really dug into this topic, so let us get right into it. What is actually going on when a beginner tries to learn English through listening?
So the first thing to understand is that not all listening is created equal. When a new learner sits down with native speed content, news, movies, podcasts made for fluent speakers, their brain is essentially trying to drink from a fire hose. The sounds are coming too fast, the vocabulary is too dense, and the brain just cannot process it in real time.
Right, and that is exactly what happened to the person I described at the top. So what should they have been doing instead?
They should have been listening at their level. And that is where the SEC comes in, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. It is the international standard used to describe language ability, and it breaks proficiencies into 6 levels: A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2.
Okay, so A1 and A2 are the 2 beginner levels. What does that actually look like in practice?
A1 is absolute beginner. We are talking about someone who can understand very basic phrases, things like greetings, numbers, colors, simple questions like, "What is your name?" or "Where is the bathroom?" Speech at A1 level is slow, clear, and uses very common words. A2 is one step up, elementary. At A2, a learner can handle simple sentences about everyday topics like family, shopping, work, and daily routines.
So it is not just about vocabulary size, it is also about how fast the speech is and how complex the sentences are.
Exactly. And that is a really important point. A lot of learners think their main problem is that they do not know enough words. But actually, even when they know the words individually, they cannot process them fast enough when those words are strung together at native speed. The brain needs time to segment the sounds, identify the words, and build meaning. And at native speed, that process just collapses for a beginner.
That is such a good way to put it. So A1, A2 listening content is basically giving the brain the time it needs to do all of that processing.
Precisely. And there is a whole body of research behind this idea. It goes back to a concept called Comprehensible Input, which was developed by linguist Stephen Krashen. The core idea is that we acquire language, not just learn it consciously, but actually internalize it when we understand the message being communicated. Not every single word, but the overall meaning.
Wait, so you do not need to understand every single word to benefit from listening?
Not every word, no, but you need to understand enough. Krashen's research suggests that the sweet spot is understanding around 95 to 98% of what you hear. If you are below that threshold, the input becomes noise, your brain cannot extract meaning, and acquisition basically stops.
And that is exactly why someone listening to native speed news radio as a beginner is basically just hearing noise.
Right. They might be picking up 5 or 10% of what is said. That is not enough for the brain to build patterns. It is frustrating, it is demoralizing, and it is actually not very efficient as a learning strategy.
So A1, A2 podcasts and listening content are specifically designed to keep learners in that 95 to 98% comprehension zone.
That is the goal, yes. And the best A1, A2 content does a few specific things. It uses high-frequency vocabulary, the most common words in English, which cover the vast majority of everyday conversation. It uses short, clear sentences. It speaks at a reduced pace, and it often focuses on topics that are familiar and concrete, like daily routines, food, travel, family, things a learner already has mental context for.
That makes so much sense. If you already know what a topic is about, you can use that context to fill in gaps even when you miss a word.
Exactly. Context is a massive aid to comprehension. And this is actually something that distinguishes good A1, A2 listening content from just slowing down a native level text. The best content is designed from the ground up with the learner in mind. The vocabulary choices, the sentence structures, the topics, all of it is calibrated.
Okay, I want to dig into the science a little more here because I think a lot of people, especially adults, feel like they should just be able to push through hard content and eventually it will click. Is that actually how language acquisition works?
It is a really common belief, and it is understandable. We are used to the idea that struggle leads to growth. And in some areas of learning, that is true. But language acquisition research tells a more nuanced story. Krashen's framework includes what he calls the affective filter hypothesis, the idea that stress, anxiety, and low confidence actually block language acquisition.
Oh, interesting. So if you are constantly confused and frustrated, your brain is actually less able to absorb the language?
That is the argument, yes. When the affective filter is high, when you are stressed or overwhelmed, the input does not get through to the language acquisition device, as Krashen calls it. But when you are relaxed, engaged, and understanding what you hear, the filter is low and acquisition happens much more naturally.
So A1, A2 content is not just easier, it is actually creating the psychological conditions for learning to happen.
Beautifully put. And there is another concept worth mentioning here. It is called I+1. The idea is that the ideal input is just one step beyond your current level. Not 2 steps, not 5 steps, just one. So if you are at A1, you want content that is mostly A1 with a little bit of A2 sprinkled in. That slight stretch is what drives progress without overwhelming you.
I love that. It is like progressive overload in fitness. You do not go from lifting 10 pounds to lifting 100 pounds overnight.
That is a great analogy. And just like in fitness, consistency matters more than intensity at the beginning. Listening to A1, A2 content for 20 minutes every day will produce far better results than one exhausting session a week with content that is way above your level.
Okay, I want to push back on something here because I think some listeners might be thinking, is there a risk of getting too comfortable at A1, A2 and just staying there forever? Like, is there a ceiling to this approach?
That is a fair concern, and it is one I hear a lot. But here is the thing. A1, A2 listening is a launch pad, not a destination. The goal is to build what researchers call automaticity. That is the ability to process language without consciously thinking about it. Once you have that foundation, moving up to B1 content feels much less daunting.
So it is about building the neural pathways first.
Exactly. Think of it like a musician practicing scales. Nobody stays on scales forever, but without that foundation, you cannot play a symphony. A1, A2 listening builds the phonological awareness, the vocabulary base, and the processing speed that makes harder content accessible later.
And I imagine the confidence factor is huge too. If you have been understanding A1, A2 content for a few weeks, you start to believe that you can actually do this.
Confidence is enormous, and it is something that is often underestimated in language learning discussions. When a learner starts to understand things, when they can follow a story, get a joke, understand directions, that positive feedback loop is incredibly motivating. It keeps them coming back. And consistency, as we said, is everything.
Let us talk about what good A1, A2 listening practice actually looks like day to day. What should someone be doing?
So there are a few key principles. First, listen actively, not just as background noise. Give the content your full attention, at least for the first listen. Try to understand the main idea. Do not pause every 5 seconds to look up words. Let the meaning wash over you.
That is interesting. So resist the urge to look everything up immediately.
On the first pass, yes. You want to train your brain to extract meaning from context, which is exactly what you do in real conversations. Nobody pauses the conversation to check a dictionary. After the first listen, then you can go back, check vocabulary, read a transcript if one is available, and listen again with that extra knowledge.
So multiple listens to the same content.
Multiple listens are incredibly powerful. Research on repeated reading and listening, sometimes called extensive reading and listening in the field, consistently shows that re-exposure to the same material deepens comprehension and accelerates vocabulary retention. The first time you hear something, you might catch 60%. The third time, you might catch 90%. And that growth is deeply satisfying.
I want to bring in something that I think is really counterintuitive here. Most people assume that children learn languages faster than adults, so adults should just mimic how children learn, total immersion, no structure. But that is not quite right, is it?
This is one of my favorite myths to address. Adults actually have significant cognitive advantages over children in language learning, particularly in the early stages. Adults have stronger working memory, better pattern recognition, and they can use their existing knowledge of grammar and vocabulary from their first language to make sense of new input. Children have time and immersion on their side. Adults have brains that are very good at finding structure.
So structured listening practice, like A1, A2 podcasts, actually plays to adult strengths.
Absolutely. Adults can consciously notice patterns, make connections, and use metacognitive strategies that children simply do not have access to. The key is pairing that cognitive strength with the right level of input, which brings us right back to A1, A2 content.
Okay, let us talk about what makes a good A1, A2 podcast specifically, because not all beginner content is created equal, right?
Right. The best A1, A2 listening content has a few hallmarks. Clear, natural-sounding speech, not robotic, but not rushed either. Topics that are relevant and interesting to the learner, because engagement drives attention and attention drives acquisition. Short episodes, 5 to 15 minutes, is ideal for beginners because sustained attention is hard when you are working in a new language.
And transcripts, I imagine those are really valuable.
Transcripts are gold. Being able to read along while you listen or to check the transcript after listening dramatically accelerates learning. It connects the spoken form of words to their written form, which reinforces both listening and reading skills simultaneously. The best A1, A2 podcasts provide full transcripts, vocabulary lists, and sometimes even comprehension questions.
That is a really complete package. And I think there is something to be said about the rise of podcasts as a format for language learning specifically. It is so accessible. You can listen on your commute, while you cook, while you exercise.
The portability of podcasts has genuinely transformed language learning. Before smartphones, you needed to be sitting at a desk with a textbook or a CD player. Now, learners can turn any dead time, a commute, a walk, a gym session, into productive listening practice. That dramatically increases the total hours of input a learner can accumulate, and hours of input are what drive progress.
Hours of input. That is the key variable.
It really is. Research on language acquisition consistently points to the importance of total input hours. And the beautiful thing about A1, A2 content is that it makes those hours enjoyable rather than painful. When you understand what you are hearing, listening is pleasurable. And pleasurable activities are ones you actually stick with.
Let us talk about some practical tips for someone who is just starting out. If someone is listening to this right now and they are at A1 level, maybe they know a few hundred English words, what should their first week look like?
Week 1 should be about building the habit and building confidence. Find one A1 level podcast or audio resource that covers topics you genuinely find interesting. Listen to one short episode, 5 to 10 minutes, every day. On the first listen, just try to get the general idea. Do not stress about every word.
And then what? Listen again?
Listen again, yes. On the second listen, try to catch more detail. If there is a transcript, read it after your second listen and note any words you did not know. Then listen one more time with that new vocabulary in mind. 3 listens to the same episode in one sitting might sound repetitive, but each listen reveals something new. Your brain is doing different work each time.
That is a really concrete routine. And I imagine after a week of that, you start to notice real progress.
Most learners do, and that early progress is so important. It creates momentum. It shifts the learner's identity from someone who is trying to learn English to someone who is learning English. That shift in self-perception has a measurable impact on motivation and persistence.
I love that framing. Okay, let us talk about a common mistake. What do beginners do wrong when it comes to listening practice?
The biggest mistake is passive listening. Putting on English content in the background while you do something else and assuming that exposure alone will lead to learning. It will not, at least not efficiently. Your brain needs to be actively engaged with the input for acquisition to happen. Background noise is just noise.
So you cannot just have English TV on in the background and expect to absorb it.
Not at the beginner level, no. At higher levels, extensive passive exposure can play a role. It helps with things like accent familiarity and picking up natural speech rhythms. But for A1, A2 learners, active focused listening is what drives real progress. Quality over quantity, at least in terms of attention.
What about the role of speaking alongside listening? Should beginners be trying to speak English at the same time as they are building their listening skills?
Speaking and listening are deeply connected. They reinforce each other. But for absolute beginners, there is a strong argument for prioritizing listening first. You need to build up a reservoir of input before you can produce output naturally. Many successful language learners go through what is called a silent period, a phase where they focus almost entirely on input before they start speaking. It is not about being shy, it is about building the foundation.
That is really reassuring for anyone who feels anxious about speaking. You do not have to jump into conversations right away.
Exactly. And when you do start speaking, having that strong listening foundation means you have a much richer bank of phrases, rhythms, and patterns to draw from. Your speech sounds more natural because you have heard natural speech so many times.
Okay, I want to zoom out for a second. We have been talking about A1, A2 listening as a technique, but I think there is a bigger picture here about what it means to be a new English learner in the world today. English is the global language of business, science, travel. The stakes are real for a lot of people.
The stakes are very real. And that is actually one of the reasons why accessible, well-designed A1, A2 content matters so much. For someone who needs English for work, for immigration, for education, the ability to understand spoken English is not a nice to have. It is a life skill, and the most efficient path to that skill starts at the right level.
And starting at the right level is not a sign of weakness. It is actually the smart move.
It is absolutely the smart move. The learner who starts at A1 and builds systematically will outpace the learner who jumps into B2 content and spends months confused and demoralized. Humility about your starting point is actually a competitive advantage in language learning.
Humility as a competitive advantage. I really like that. Let us talk about how you know when you are ready to move up from A1, A2 to the next level. What are the signs?
Great question. The clearest sign is when A1, A2 content starts to feel easy, when you are understanding almost everything on the first listen without much effort. That feeling of ease is not boredom, it is automaticity. Your brain has internalized those patterns. That is when you know it is time to introduce some B1 content alongside your A2 material.
So you do not just switch cold, you blend levels.
Blending is a great strategy. Keep some A2 content in your rotation for confidence and fluency building and start introducing B1 content for the challenge. That way you are always in the comprehensible input zone, mostly understanding with a little stretch. It is a gradual, sustainable progression.
And I imagine the topics you choose matter a lot for that transition too.
Enormously. If you are moving to B1 content, start with topics you already know well. Your job, your hobbies, your city. Familiar topics give you contextual scaffolding that compensates for the increased linguistic difficulty. Save unfamiliar topics for when your overall level is higher.
That is such practical advice. Okay, I think we are getting close to wrapping up, but I want to make sure we have covered the emotional side of this. Because learning a language as an adult is genuinely hard, and a lot of people give up. What keeps people going?
What keeps people going is progress they can feel. And that is exactly what A1, A2 listening provides. Tangible, measurable progress. You listen to an episode you could not understand a month ago, and now you understand it. That is real. That is motivating. The learners who give up are usually the ones who never experienced that feeling because they were always working above their level.
So the method itself is the motivation.
When it is the right method, yes. Success breeds motivation, which breeds more practice, which breeds more success. It is a virtuous cycle, and it all starts with that first decision to meet yourself where you are, at A1 or A2, and build from there.
So when you step back from everything we have talked about today, here is what this really comes down to. The biggest mistake new English learners make is not a lack of effort. It is a mismatch between their level and their input. They are working incredibly hard, but they are working on the wrong material.
That is exactly it. Effort without the right input is like running on a treadmill. You are exhausted, but you have not gone anywhere. A1, A2 listening content is the road, not the treadmill. It is designed to take you somewhere. And the research on comprehensible input, on the affective filter, on automaticity, all of it points in the same direction. Start where you are, understand what you hear, build from there.
And the beautiful irony is that the approach that feels easier, listening to content at your level, is actually the approach that gets you to fluency faster.
That is the counterintuitive truth at the heart of language acquisition research. Easier input done consistently beats harder input done sporadically and painfully every time. The tortoise really does beat the hare here, but only if the tortoise is on the right path.
I love that. So here is your action step. If you are a new English learner, find one A1 or A2 podcast today. Listen to one short episode, listen to it 3 times, check the transcript, write down 5 new words. Do that every day for 2 weeks. And then think back to that person we talked about at the top. the one who spent 6 months listening to native speed radio and made almost no progress. The difference between that person and the one who succeeds is not talent, not time, not even effort. It is the decision to start at the right level. That is it. Thanks for listening to Copilot Podcasts. And if you
Thanks for listening to English Never Give Up podcast. And if you are learning English right now, you are already doing something remarkable.